All right, hello everybody. We're gonna get started. Good morning from Sydney. I know we have viewers from all over the world, but it's here in Sydney. It is a beautiful morning right now. I'm Gabriel Metcalf. I am the CEO of the Committee for Sydney. And this is the next installment of Committee for Sydney Live, featuring Alex Steffen. You know, we are still in lockdown. The mood, maybe everywhere, is one of impatience. People want to be allowed to get back to life as they know it. At the same time, I think we are all gradually coming to realize we may never get back to life the way it was. We may be faced with a very long, awkward transition period when things are partly open, partly closed. It was, for me, particularly depressing to see that Singapore, which we've been celebrating for its effectiveness, and that's all still true, but Singapore had to go back into lockdown. Today, we want to take on the question about the new normal, about how much of a disjuncture this whole experience is going to be. And of course, we don't know the answer yet, right? You only know those things in hindsight, but it is the job of people like Alex Steffen to help us think about the future. So let me just briefly read a few highlights from his bio and then turn it over. Alex Steffen, futurist and award-winning writer, speaker, and foresight consultant, one of the world's leading voices on sustainability and the future of the planet. He was Planetary Futurist in residence at the design firm IDEO. His book, Carbon Zero, Imagining Cities That Can Save the Planet, explores the kinds of design, technology, and policy innovations that can transform our cities into low-carbon engines of prosperity. And from 2003 to 2010, he ran the pioneering sustainability and social innovation project, worldchanging.com, and edited 2 best-selling world-changing books. I've known Alex for a long time. He's had a very big influence on my thinking. So it is a real honor to have him share his thoughts. COVID-19, how much normalcy will we return to? So the way this works, I'll turn it over to Alex now. In the end, when he's done, I'll ask questions. All of you can submit questions through the Q&A part of the Zoom app, and I will do my best to sort through them. So we'll see you on the other side of Alex's talk.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here talking with you. I know that times are stressful and hard for a lot of people, and so I hope that you're keeping well. And I hope that our conversation today can be at least a bit of context to help think through what is going on and put things, in a larger picture. The most important thing that I wanted to share today is I'm a futurist, and futurists have a concept that we use called the discontinuity. The idea is that most of the time we have continuity, we have trends, we have forces that are ongoing. One day is much like the next, but every once in a while we experience a discontinuity, which is a break in the order of things. It's best understood as a moment where we recognize a before and an after. And this happens in our daily lives. We might experience a discontinuity with, say, the birth of our first child, or with a sudden change in our job, or with the onset of a war or a natural disaster. These things change how we look at the world, and the way we were thinking about it before no longer perfectly applies to what's come after. And whenever we experience a discontinuity, it's jarring, it's emotionally stressful. It's also, though, an opportunity for us to really ask, what do we know now? What are we certain of? And quite often what we find out in the midst of any kind of discontinuity is that things that we thought were stable and certain before were actually less certain and less stable. And discontinuities often reveal larger ongoing trends in the fabric of society and our lives. And I think it's almost certainly true that COVID-19 has done that for all of our societies, that we are experiencing revelations of the way we've structured our lives and the vulnerabilities that structure brings to us. We're certainly seeing a re-examination of how cities and the economy and trade and our daily lives intersect. Most of us, I think, are much more aware of issues of public health, say, or of international supply chains than we were just a couple months ago. And one of the things that I wanted to do is stop and just look for a second at what seems to have changed, what seems to be a thing that is no longer the old normal. And certainly there are lots of them, and I'm not going to try and overlook, give an overview of them all. But there are a few things that I think are really critical to look at. And one of them is just simply the uncertainty about the safety and nature of our microbial environment, right? Pandemics are, in a weird way, an environmental issue, right? They're about what is surrounding us. And we have been able to take for granted, at least in the wealthier parts of the world, that in general, our surroundings are fairly safe. That when we go outside, we're unlikely to just catch a disease that could be deadly. We're suddenly being forced to reconsider that assumption. And that alone is a big discontinuity. And I think it's going to change all sorts of things about how people interact, how we socialize, how we raise our kids, and so forth. And that concern is going to go on in waves and for years. The latest information seems to show that we're not going to just go through this issue and then come out the other side, right? That it's not an issue in the same way that a discrete problem is. It's actually an ongoing problem that we will be dealing with until we have a vaccine and other support systems, and that it reveals the kind of thing that we may be vulnerable to again, right? That there's, as climate change worsens, as trade grows, as there's more and more interaction between humans and wildlife, we've been being told for years that we can expect more pandemics, more epidemics at least. And so the ability for us to go out our door and think of the world as fundamentally safe has been changed. It's been shifted, I think, unfortunately, permanently. But that shift also carries some pretty deep implications in other aspects of our lives. Almost all of us on this call are working from home. Our businesses have been disrupted. Our office life has been disrupted. There's economic pressure in every country on earth in a way that there hasn't been in at least a generation. It's exceeded now in most places the impacts of the subprime crisis. That's a really big shift, and a lot of people are having to suddenly reimagine what their work lives are going to be like come next year, 5 years from now, or even Monday, right? And that shift in how we see the business environment, economic landscape, again, I think that is not going to go back to normal anytime soon. People will adapt, new things will happen, there'll be innovation and entrepreneurship and public sector responses, and we will move forward. But I don't think we're going to go back to a confident assumption that things like pandemics are safely distant and unlikely external impacts on our professional lives. Similarly, and I know folks in Australia are particularly aware of some of this, there's obviously going to be long-term impacts on travel and tourism and hospitality. and I suspect that we're in for a pretty major rethink of those industries, and that especially as we look at the ways in which uh, some of the changes are permanent, or at least long lasting, I suspect we're never going to go back to the kind of just ubiquitous, common, international travel and tourism that we saw up until very recently. There's some real signs that entire set of industries has shifted, both internationally and locally. Certainly there's a lot of turbulence right now, for example, in the hospitality sector of restaurants and bars and so forth. And those are going to be changed, right? Again, I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know. I just wanted to kind of flesh out a picture. In addition, there's some fundamental ways that we interact with different countries, no matter which country we're in, having to do with things like supply chains and business travel and immigration. The ways in which we are deeply enmeshed in this global economy are put under, at very least, transformative strain. At very least, the nature of these things has shifted. We are more aware than ever of the precarity of very long and very complex supply chains. We are, increasingly, I think, aware of the interconnection of our own physical existence with the physical existence of people far away, right? I would bet that many of us, certainly I was one of them, could not have put a pin in Wuhan on a map, 5 months ago. And, now we know that we are deeply connected to the people of that city, in a very, very real, direct way. All of this raises the question of, if we have left what we thought of as normal, if we've experienced a discontinuity, if we're going to think about COVID-19 and this pandemic as a before and after event, our lives before this happened and our lives now. If all this is true, the important question to ask is, are we headed towards a new normal or not? And one of the best ways that I know of to think about this is to think about the extent to which other systems around the system that's been disrupted are essentially stable or not. And this is where we come to the question of climate change. Now, obviously, everyone on the planet is thinking more about their immediate term prospects right now than what we believe to be the longer term prospects of climate change and climate impacts. That said, the future isn't as far away as it used to be, and many of the kinds of impacts that we for decades have been being told to expect are unfolding around us. And obviously, Australians have gotten a very strong taste of this, with the fires and the problems on the Great Barrier Reef and so forth. But these kinds of problems are occurring everywhere. We have in California, where I live, a fire season, a smoke season in the late summer, early autumn, where we just have to expect that the air is dangerous from wildfire smoke, and that's probably just going to continue for a while. And as we sort of look at this question of stability, of how something like COVID-19 fits into larger issues of stability, we're forced to ask, have we taken the threats to these systems seriously enough? And unfortunately, I think the answer is that we haven't. That whether we're talking about climate impacts on our physical lives, direct risks, or climate impacts on business, the kinds of rapid shifts that we're going to be seeing, or threats to the financial system, changes in governance, triggering of mass migration, all of these kinds of issues are, I think, becoming instabilities around our daily lives rather than being sources of stability. And if we were headed back into a new normal where we could say, wow, good thing we went through that time, but things have returned to normal, we would have to be seeing a lot more stability around us, right? We would have to be understanding the world to be headed back into a greater sense of normalcy, even though we've gone through this event. And I think the evidence is pretty strongly in the opposite direction, that we're going to be increasingly aware of the need to act on climate, not just the extent to which climate is a problem, but the extent to which action itself creates discontinuities around us. Whole industries are being put under question, not just fossil fuel extraction, but all sorts of industries. You have competition between high and low carbon options. You have awareness increasingly of the need to ruggedize against threats, right? The need to prepare for a greater range of possible natural states to protect cities against sea level rise, for example. We have the need to begin to think about how do we create a system where we can continue with our daily lives and with the important aspects of, of living our lives in our community, making a living, creating progress, and so forth. How do we do that when everything is unstable? And that's a question that in climate, people have been asking for a while now. And we see from this, the emergence of this word that I just used, ruggedization. And it's not a word we tend to use a lot, so I want to explain it. It actually came out of thinking of the US military. And to ruggedize the thing is to harden it in ways that preserve its essential function, even if it takes damage, right? Or even if it's expected to exposed to an unexpected condition, right? So a ruggedized laptop is one that can take a bullet and you can still check Facebook. We're in a situation now where we're being forced to not only rethink high carbon systems, resource intensive systems, but also to ruggedize against impacts that we know are coming and ruggedize against impacts, and this is a critical point, that we aren't sure are coming yet. Because loss of predictability is a third aspect of climate change, especially the climate emergency, sort of encompassing all of the climate and environmental issues we're dealing with. That loss of predictability is an aspect that we're really just beginning to wrestle with. When you talk to people, for example, in fields where measuring risk and mitigating it is essential, you're hearing a lot of concern that we no longer know quite how to price risk, that we no longer quite know how to know where is an appropriate place to grant flood insurance, to back flood insurance, to offer fire insurance. To what degree do we need to stress test investments before we make them, to make sure that they don't expose large institutions to financial uncertainties? We're only at the beginning of that, because the fundamental reality of the interactions of climate, environmental degradation, population growth, problems of economic development and challenges there, and all of the kinds of interruptions that we see with things like COVID or other international crises. The combination of those things is not only making it harder to use our existing predictive tools, it's actually telling us that our existing predictive tools don't tell us a lot about what we need to know. So it's not just that our predictions are getting worse, we're starting to see blank spots appear on the map. And that, I think, is relevant to absolutely anybody who is thinking seriously about the future, is understanding that there's just a lot more we don't know and can't know yet. And that almost never are those uncertainties to our advantage, right? Because we live in a society that's built on predictability, right? We build bridges on the prediction that it will only have to bear a certain amount of weight and the river beneath it will only rise a certain amount in a flood. We build buildings based on the idea that the place where people live has a certain range of temperatures that are normal and expected, and it won't go 10 degrees hotter than it ever has before. These tolerances are built into every aspect of our society, and when we lose the predictability that underlies those tolerances, we lose a lot more than just the ability to guess right. We lose the certainty that things around us will work. On top of all of this is the reality that we are, that human beings are complex, and we do things for a variety of reasons. And some of those reasons are because we have an opportunity to do something different to our advantage. And I think one of the things that we really underestimate is the magnitude of opportunity that happens when we experience a discontinuity, right? for all the things that become uncertain, for all the losses we face, for all the costs we have to bear, for all the psychological stress, there's always, there are always opportunities that open up that simply weren't accessible or even visible before the discontinuity. And as people rush to take advantage of these opportunities, we're going to see, a fourth kind of pressure on our systems, which is simply an acceleration of the rate of positive change, or at least of intentional change. And, we've lived through a very stable period, most of us, all but the oldest folks listening have lived through a period of time where, we haven't gone through major upheavals of the kind that were regular in human history before. And, there's a lot of reason to believe that even the things that we want to do now to make our lives better, to improve our societies, to gain prosperity, to help our families, that these things are going to become faster and more disruptive by themselves. And so the question becomes really, how do we start to understand a set of systems that we haven't maybe taken seriously enough, that are all in disruption around us, and that are all coming to a peak at the very moment that we're struggling with this pandemic? Because the unfortunate aspect of all this is that climate change and the related issues around it are all time-based, right? And they're all here now. So they're only going to grow more urgent. Action will only grow more inevitable. The need to assess costs and risks will only increase. And so it's not like we can put consideration of those issues on hold for the year or 3 years or 5 years that we need to, grapple with the realities of COVID-19. They're going to continue playing out, and we're going to continue to have to think about how do we measure the stability of our lives, not just in terms of what's immediately in front of us, but what's going on around us. And that raises the very real risk that we are not going from a normal to a new normal, but rather that we're going from normal to after normal. That the very idea of normal that we've come to have when we think about our lives, our businesses, our cities, our hopes and dreams, that very normal that we've come to expect, that we all grew up telling each other and understanding it was true, that these are the way things are, that normalcy itself may be one of the things that's shifted. And we may have to think about a world that requires us to have a readiness to question and learn and re-envision and reimagine and act in ways that we previously wouldn't have considered. And if there could be any upside in what is a horrible tragedy in this pandemic, I think one of the upsides is that it's giving us a taste of what that's like before the real impact hits, right? It's giving us a chance to prepare our minds to understand the idea of living in a world where normal is not something we can rely on. And yet still we have to function, we have to live in the world. And that, I think, if we don't waste the crisis, can actually lead us forward in a lot of ways. And I think in particular, cities can start to think about what is really important to this city. What are the driving engines of its prosperity? How do we ruggedize those? How do we diversify them? How do we rethink them and advance them intentionally? How do we play ahead of the curve if possible? But also, what is the city for? One of the really amazing things that we're seeing is a really bold rethinking of urban space as this is happening all around the city, all around the world. Cities are closing down streets. They're repurposing facilities. Restaurants are changing to takeout, impromptu social distancing, gatherings are happening. All of these things are different ways of using a set of, systems and spaces that we've taken for granted working a certain way. And I think that, again, gives us a lot of opportunity to think about, okay, as we emerge out of this immediate crisis into this era that may be an after normal era, how do we start to bring that thinking into our cities? How do we start to make that a positive thing for our communities? How do we see the opportunities that presents? And it's not easy. I'm not saying that I have the answers, certainly. But I think we're starting to see some really tantalizing glimpses of what a city that's built for the now, for what's actually unfolding around us, might look like. And that many of the changes that might encompass, we could find are, in fact, beneficial in lots of other ways. That there may be a way to live in the world after normal that produces, that leaves us much better off. So with that, I would love to take questions and talk with you about these ideas. Again, I don't have the answers, but I'm really interested in exploring questions.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Really appreciate it. As you look around, all the different kinds of responses coming from all different parts of the world, where do you see which societies or which cities do you think are starting to show some promising signs in terms of where you actually being responsive to the now, as you put it?
Well, I think there are a handful of cities that were already thinking along some of these lines in terms of how they deal with climate, energy, resource issues. Paris, for example, has been doing quite a lot. And so they were already prepared to sort of leap into using social spaces in a different way. And they've done a lot of that. We've seen echoes of this all over. I mean, even Oakland, which is the city next to where I live, closed 74 miles of its street. We're seeing a lot of that kind of sudden repurposing of social space that I think is built often on previous successes of reimagining small reimaginings of uses of public space. But I think that the really interesting question is going to be how many of these are turned into semi-permanent or permanent improvements to the city with the recognition that this kind of thing is going to go on. And there's some very strong moves being made. I think Portland has been doing some interesting things, for example. Here in San Francisco and the Bay Area, there's been some attention being paid to how do we reimagine transit use, which is way down, obviously. How do we reimagine bike lanes? How do people here, and I don't know about Sydney, but we're seeing more and more people just use the street for walking and biking and hanging out. That may be a profound change. I have yet to see a really strong articulation of how a city's planning and development agenda could be changed, in a more aggressive way to support the benefits of that kind of thing, or even how we really, do decision making as we sort of emerge from each wave. But those are a few examples.
I'm curious what your view is on the Asian technocracies, the South Korea, Seoul, Singapore, Hong Kong, which have much more robust public health systems, much more ability to test, trace, quarantine, are still struggling with this. The Western commentators who are, not just discounting them as an ineffable other, but are actually really trying to grapple with whether their solutions could be adapted into the context of the US or the UK or Australia. There's a lot of worrying about the creation of a permanent surveillance state with powers and technologies capable of greater monitoring and control of the population. But you see even real liberals, in the small L sense, worrying about whether it's time to go there yet. Do you think that is the type of cultural change that we're going to see come to the West?
Well, first of all, I think the concerns are very real. I think we need to be very careful about setting up, an epidemiological police state. It's much harder to dismantle these sorts of things than it is to build them, and that's a concern that we need to think about. we need to debate it strongly. On the other hand, I think one of the things that we're running into here is the pervasive reality of emergency problems. And emergencies function in a different way than our normal lives. And it's not clear that, I'm just going to speak for America here, though I know there are some parallels, at least, with the Australian experience and the experience elsewhere. It's not clear that we can rely on enough people to do the right thing, to manage a problem that is outside of their normal experience, and therefore they maybe don't take seriously enough. There's obviously disinformation and political agendas and various other things floating around that don't help. But there is fundamentally this problem of when you have a life and death situation and you can't necessarily rely on consensual self-policing, what do you do? And I think we're going to bump up into that problem very hard. And I think we're going to probably come out of this without having to necessarily take the kind of steps that, say a South Korea has. But I think we're going to find ourselves needing to use a lot more technology and have a lot more sort of sense of our microbial environment and the way in which people are carrying things around with them than we did before. I don't think we're going back to a normal where we just don't worry about that. I think there's a parallel there as well with climate, which is that we have tended to frame climate action largely in terms of choices, right? Largely in terms of what people who are concerned or what businesses who want to make a difference can do to make things less bad. And we are entering a point now where many of the solutions are not going to be about choices, they're going to be about replacements of one industry with another, of one kind of product with another. An approach to climate that was ragtag and voluntary is not going to cut it as climate bites harder and deeper. And again, there are these questions of how much government do we want in the economy? How much of a sense of we're going to set the boundaries and people just have to live with them are we willing to accept? I think we're talking about, with Australia and the US, two of the most individualistic countries on earth, with a proud tradition of not necessarily wanting to give up one's personal liberties. And I don't know what that impact will be like. But I think we also have to consider the possibility that technological public health, observation, tracking, etc., may also be met by a genuine change in the culture that allows us to be more savvy about what we're doing to reduce the need for those kinds of intrusions, and possibly also to be in better control of those kind of systems than we would appear to be ready to be now, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, you don't need an ankle bracelet to monitor whether somebody is remaining in quarantine if you can trust that people told to quarantine will stay there. But the stakes can be so high for a small number of people breaking their own quarantine, just to use a pretty obvious example. I think it's been really interesting watching how significant church has been for spreading this pandemic in many different countries. And that's a place where America is in probably a lot more trouble than Australia, because so many more people go to church. And it's so unconstitutional in the US to put any limits on that. And so to the degree that pastors are going to insist that they have a right to gather big crowds of people together, even while the kids can't go to the underground clubs to go dancing, I think you're going to see some huge debates about civil liberties. I don't know how those are going to get resolved. This goes on a really long time. Okay, I have so many questions. Let me just get a couple more. A bunch here asking about geopolitical fallout, where you see a lot of people observing that the reputation of countries could really change coming out of this based on how they navigated it. On the other hand, some countries could totally collapse, and certainly throughout history, we've seen regimes fall when they failed to protect their population from external shocks. Certainly, there's been a complete failure of international institutions, from the European Union to the World Health Organization to the United Nations, which nobody even remembers exists still. Certainly the role the US once played, it no longer plays. Are we going to see things like annexations that become accepted because there's nobody to stop them? Or I mean, how do we think the geopolitical kind of system is going to evolve in response to this?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that I was trying to get at when I was talking about discontinuities is that discontinuities often reveal existing ignored weaknesses, right? And we're certainly seeing that in the U.S., right? The failure of our healthcare system to treat everyone equitably is manifest, right? The failure of our sense of common purpose here, where with deeply divided and ideologically split ideas, even about like the nature of the virus, right? That's being revealed, right? The difficulties of all sorts of systems to adapt and to be functional now are being revealed. You know, my understanding from talking with people elsewhere is that, you know, this is a pretty widespread feeling, even in what we think of as incredibly well-run countries, right? The countries that are always at the top of like the Transparency International Index and the Human Development Index, you know, countries like Sweden, right? Even there's a feeling of like, we're not doing a good enough job, and who knew that we wouldn't be ready to do a good enough job? So there's the revelation of problems that people were able to ignore before that comes with any discontinuity, right? So they're forced into the open. But I also think that we have to remember that when you have, you know, turbulence in society, things go two ways, right? So there's one thing that they talk about, like, you know, there's have you heard about so what's it called? I believe it's called the Disaster Libel, which is a term that people who do disaster response have. I may be getting that slightly wrong, but the concept is this, that we have this idea that when things really fall apart, what happens is anarchy, you know, it's Mad Max in the streets. But in fact, what happens almost all the time is that people help each other, right? That neighbors look out for each other, that people come together, that they're willing to work harder, sacrifice more, that people want to bond together in a disaster. They want to take care of one another. And so on the one hand, you have that effect of turbulence, right? That people want to come together, they want to do better. But there's also, of course, the other part of this, which is that, you know, whenever you have this kind of turbulence, it opens up gaps in enforcement, gaps in business models, et cetera. And you also see, you know, a increase in, you know, in shady dealings, right? You know, what some people refer to as arbitraging misery, right? What other people talk about is like disaster capitalism. And those almost always only become visible in retrospect, right? It's pretty hard to see some of them. And I think one of the big open questions right now is, how much is the international order, you know, as shaky as it is, how much is it being subjected to those kind of forces? Like, to what degree are we only going to hear later about things that have been done that were shady, corrupt, you know, conflictual, whatever, and people got away with them because they could now. And I think we're going to have to think very hard about, you know, international law, about governance, about re-knitting together the international system in ways that I don't know if we're prepared to do, to be honest.
There's a Milton Friedman quote that's been making the rounds lately that I love. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around at the time. which is from the Introduction to Capitalism and Freedom. I want to ask you about crisis. There's of course the more recent version of never let a crisis go to waste. But what we know from history is that crisis does not necessarily lead to a good response. The Great Depression prompted fascism just as much as it prompted the New Deal. Those were both attempts to respond to the crisis of the economic collapse 100 years ago. So thinking today about Green New Deal versus predatory delay, Green New Deal being the intuition so many people have that we need to mobilize the economy into a direction that is both good for the planet and creates a lot of jobs. A sort of obvious point, but seemingly very impossible to actually undertake at scale. Predatory delay being a term that is you either coined or is very associated with you.
I did coin it, yeah.
Yeah. That just taking too long to decide things in the era of climate change is actually a genocidal act because of the impact of just taking too long, and that every year what happens in terms of the climate impact. So you can really see that coming out of this crisis, it could go both ways or some weird combination, but what does it take to make sure the crisis is used in a constructive way?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a huge question, right? But I would first of all, I would say that one of the questions that makes up that question is, to what degree do we see the imperative to change in terms of an opportunity we can meet together, and to what degree do we see it as a problem to be resisted, right? So we're seeing this with climate change. You know, as you mentioned, there are various kinds of proposals for moving forward to solve these sets of problems together to the benefit of more people. And there are already, you know, a number of interests who are playing for time, you know, who have unsustainable business models and who are seeing it to be in their advantage to delay action as long as possible, right? Not because we're going to end up in the long run not having acted, but because, you know, if you can not have to change anything about your business model for 10 more years of profit, well, you know, then the thinking, I think, is we'll figure out what to do then. Then we'll have made 10 years of profit. And it's a pretty common phenomenon. I think the real question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the model of the crisis that we face? Certainly it's got some Great Depression in it. We're experiencing a lot of economic turmoil, a lot of fallout from what's been going on. And a lot of people are hurting, and it's going to change our politics. It's going to change our societies. But I think there's a case to be made that what's going on is actually something closer to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Except for this time we're on the wrong side of the wall, right? We're being forced to, as you know, people reported, the Soviet Union, citizens of the Soviet Union being forced to do. We're being forced to confront the ways in which the systems around us are out of date. The degree to which leadership has not moved us forward, you know, the degree to which some of our models for understanding how things work no longer apply very well. And I think that that what comes out of this is going to be sort of, in some ways, a cross section of those two things, right? The sort of brutal awareness that we've gone through a discontinuity, right? That there was a before the wall fell and an after the wall fell, a before COVID-19 and an after COVID-19, and before we understood climate was imperative to act upon, and, you know, after. And that in that way, that's something much more like the fall of the Soviet Union, with all the turmoil and consequences that brought forward. But in another way, we do live in societies, you know, certainly most of the people on this call live in societies that are relatively stable, relatively healthy, you know, relatively rich compared to historical precedents. And so for a lot of people, this is that kind of dislocating fall, economic fall, right? You know, the Depression itself was rocked so many people because people who had felt themselves to be hardworking, prosperous, you know, doing well, and stable suddenly found themselves, for reasons that they had no control over, you know, destitute. And that happened all around the world, but especially, as you know, in the US and Germany. Um, and I think that the difficult part here is that for a lot of people who are experiencing a fall, what they want is the restoration of normal, right? They want what they had back. And that can be a very strong driver. And I think we see some of that in calls for example, fair transitions on climate, right? The idea that we need to keep the kind of economy we had, just make it greener, right? On the other hand, like, people who are experiencing discontinuity, you know, may understand some of those kinds of efforts to be counter to their own interests, right? That the need to change, to improve, to progress, right, to reform is more important than the need to restore. And I think that tension is in all of our societies right now. And I don't know how it's going to play out. I do think there are some reasons to be, you know, there are some reasons to be extremely concerned. But I think there's also some reasons to believe that some of the kinds of capabilities we have to spread prosperity, to reform systems, to do new things, to innovate, you know, could take us forward. The writing is not on the wall yet. So how's that for a I won't take a position answer?
Boy, it turns out we have a lot of very apocalyptic thinkers in the membership of the Committee for Sydney, reading these questions. Look, a lot of people wondering, you know, we knew we had overshot the ecological carrying capacity, or ecological footprint of the Earth in the way we were living. We knew that the interface between people and nature wasn't being managed the right way. We knew there was too much air travel, and that was projected for OECD countries to become, you know, a huge portion of overall carbon emissions in the future. Is this just a message that we need to retreat, to live in a more humble way in order to be back in balance? I mean, I'm merging a bunch of questions here, but a bunch of sentiments.
Yeah. Well, so, you know, one of the questions is, I think, always, what's the solution here, right? Do we need to change ourselves or change our societies? And you know, there's obviously strong arguments for each. I would point out that changing ourselves has the same problem that, like, self-isolation does with COVID, right? That a lot of these are problems where us not all changing together is a crisis by itself. And I suspect that we're going to end up almost everywhere far more on the side of the spectrum that says we need to change big systems. We need to change, you know, the actual technological and industrial systems we use, but also, you know, regulatory approaches, legal approaches, you know, trade rules, et cetera, that we're going to see pretty large scale transformations of our society over the next 20 years. I think there's always another question underneath that, though, which, you know, is essentially the question of, you know, how screwed are we, right? How bad are things? And, you know, it is easy and satisfying to believe, like, that it's just gone too far, so I'm not going to worry about it. You know, it's like we're doomed, so I'm just going to, play a little more golf and spend more time with kids, right? That's an easy thing to think. But, you know, the good news and the bad news is that there is a very, very long, you know, shallow slope between our current situation and, you know, the end of everything. And there's a lot of reason to believe that we're unlikely to go to the end of everything, that we're going to be talking about, you know, a managed catastrophe. And that makes things more difficult, right? It makes them harder to figure out. It makes them harder to understand, what do we feel about that, right? Like, if we're going to win altogether and, like, just have a great world, well, great. You know, if a lot of things we love are going to blink out, you know, species that we, you know, animals and fish that we love, places that we love, are going to go away. Cities we love are going to be impacted. You know, national treasures, hurt. You know, the quality of our society downgraded, and we're going to be put under this huge strain of having to change. That's a more ambiguous result, but I think it's closer to the truth, and it's harder to kind of go, well, that's great, right? Because there are a lot of problems that are just givens now, and yet somehow we have to find a way to live in that after normal, and you know, recognize that it has its own opportunities and its own potentialities. And I think the real test of that is that as kids today grow up, you know, we have what we call the shifting baseline phenomenon, right? Which is that over time, our idea of normal changes as normal changes. And we forget that something that it now exists would have shocked us 20 years ago, right? And kids today are sort of entering, you know, into this new era in a sort of year zero way, right? They have no idea really of what came before. And I think to them, the idea of ongoing, disruptive, difficult, confusing, you know, sometimes like brilliant change is going to just seem how the world works. And so we might sort of try and anticipate what we might think, how we might think about a world that's in that kind of upheaval, right? That's in that kind of change. And how do we become native to what's going on now, right? How do we make ourselves at home in this new era? And, you know, that's a lot tougher than just, you know, either saying everything's going to turn out okay or that we're doomed.
Alex, a few questions here asking about democratic structures and the question of federalism. One thing that Australia and the US and Canada all share is a notion that the states or provinces came first, and that they're the primary first unit of government. That's true to varying degrees across those three countries, but all of them have over time migrated in the other direction, where the national government is perceived to come first. So people asking, does that work? When you are asking the states to make fundamental decisions in a pandemic, but they don't actually literally get to control their own borders. So if California is doing the right thing, but Nevada isn't, and California can't stop people in Nevada from crossing the border, does this new awareness of interdependence mean that federal structures don't work as well anymore?
There's a simultaneous phenomenon of a growing awareness of interdependence, right? And of the need to actually function beyond even the nation state, right? That there are problems here that can't even be adequately addressed by any single country. And certainly we owe a lot more to, for example, the global public health system than most of us realize, you know? And the countless other treaty organizations and standards groups and everything else, right? Those are really much more important, I think, than a lot of us need to think about, right? At the same time, it's pretty sure, or at least I feel pretty sure, that there are going to be vast differences in the capacity and readiness and political will to act on these various things. That we're going to see, you know, wide differences between geographies and between polities, between different states of development, certainly, but like also within countries. Like in the US, we have a really profound polarization about what the appropriate responses are to these things. And that polarization is to a very real extent geographic now. And that geography conforms to, you know, to a large extent to polity, right? To specific states and regions. And so we have this, you know, situation right now where the three Western state governors of Washington, Oregon, and California have announced that they're part of this new, you know, pandemic pact to, you know, sort of manage at a sub-nation state level, like all of the issues relating to public health. Because people on the West Coast want to move faster than is going to be the case for people in the deepest, deepest red, most conservative states. And so there's this sort of spikiness, if you will, like a sort of a difference in, a profound difference in the level of action that various places are having. And I think that is both, there are more possibilities there than we tend to think. Even in the US, where state powers are extremely limited in some ways, states are finding they can do an awful lot. And they can do a lot more than they maybe even thought they could. And there are certainly a lot of people in this situation who are arguing for us to be creative in finding even more ways for states that are acting boldly to move fast. But at the same time, there are these differences. There are these, like, what are the interactions between these, wildly different levels of action? Like, what are the interactions between those places, between those economies? And I think we tend to think of it in terms of how do we all move together at the same time? And that would be ideal, right? It would be ideal to have widespread commonality and common agreement on the way to handle big crises like this. But that seems unlikely to me. And I think we're more likely instead to see profound differences in not only preparation and ability to act, but outcome among different, parts of nations, different cities within regions, et cetera. And I don't think we've really, that's not in the way, that's not in the mental landscape we inherited from the 20th century about how our nations are supposed to work, right?
All right. But any final thoughts, Alex, you want to share?
Well, I think that the main thing I would say is that this is a time when we really have to question. We really have to question systems. We have to have more of these kinds of conversations. We need to, ask what could work, what could be, how can we imagine it being different? Like, what if things, in fact, are not going back to normal? And that act of questioning and imagination in our own organizations, institutions, even in our, even in our communities, is vital now in a way that it probably hasn't been for a really long time. And I think that in many ways, the places that do the best, the companies that do the best, even maybe the individuals that do the best, are going to be the ones who are best at asking those kind of questions. And I think that's a new kind of leadership we haven't necessarily emphasized in recent years. But I think we're going to have to, find more leaders who are good at leading us through explorations. And so I would just maybe, end on the thought of, let's think about what that kind of leadership is and how we can embody that as individuals.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex, for sharing your thoughts. Everybody, thank you for tuning in to Committee for Sydney Live. We'll be bringing more of this your way every week, and we'll see you at the next one. All right, bye.
Great. Thank you very much.